the widower who opened his door when the whole town turned cold. The night Clara Whitcomb thought she would die, the snow was so deep against the cabin door that even the wind sounded trapped. It clawed at the roof. It pushed cold through every crack in the walls. It hissed under the floorboards and slipped beneath the thin quilt where Clara held her little boy close to her chest. 8-year-old Eli had stopped shivering an hour before, and that frightened her more than the storm. A child should shake in the cold. When they stopped shaking, it meant the cold had gone too deep. Clara pressed her lips to his hair. It smelled faintly of smoke from the last piece of fence rail she had burned that morning. There was nothing left for the stove now. Not a stick, not a splinter, not even a chair leg she could break without waking the boy and making him see how bad things truly were. The stove sat black and useless in the corner, its iron mouth open like it was ashamed. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, though Eli could not hear her. "I tried, baby." Outside, the Montana hills lay buried under a white fury. Their small claim, 3 miles above the town of Mercy Creek, had never been kind land. Her husband, Joseph, had believed it could be made into something. He had stood on that rise 2 summers before, with the sun on his face and hope in both hands, and told Clara there was room here for cattle, corn, and a future. By the next winter, fever had taken him. By this winter, hope had worn thin as muslin. Clara had done what proud widows often do. She had smiled in town. She had paid for flour with coins saved in a teacup. She had mended Eli's coat so many times that the patches had patches of their own. When Mrs. Pruitt at the mercantile asked if she had enough wood for the first storm, Clara had lifted her chin and said she would manage. She had said it because the words, "I need help," felt heavier than any load of firewood. Now those words sat inside her like stones. Eli stirred against her. "Mama," he breathed. "I'm here. Is morning soon?" Clara looked toward the window, but the glass was white with frost. Morning could have been an hour away or a lifetime. "Yes," she lied softly, "soon. Will Pa know where we are?" Her hand tightened around his shoulder. The question went through her cleaner than a knife. "He knows," she said. "Your pa always knows." Eli settled again, trusting her because children do that, even when grown folks have run out of truth. Clara closed her eyes and saw Joseph's face as it had been before sickness hollowed it out. She saw him laughing at Eli chasing chickens through the yard. She saw his hand resting on the half-built fence. She saw the last look he gave her, full of sorrow because he knew he was leaving her with land too hard, a boy too young, and a world that asked widows to be grateful for pity. A tear slid down her temple and disappeared into her hair. She did not want Eli found frozen in that bed. That was the thought she could not bear. Across the valley, behind a line of black pines, another house burned warm against the storm. Caleb Rusk had not slept much in 2 nights. He stood at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, watching snow sweep sideways past the glass. His ranch, the Bar Lantern, had survived worse winters, though not many. The barn was tight. The woodpile was high. His 2 children slept upstairs under good blankets, though his youngest, Ruth, still cried out some nights for a mother who had been in the ground nearly 3 years. Caleb looked toward the hills. He had been looking that way since dawn. From that window on clear mornings, he could see the thin line of smoke from Clara Whitcomb's chimney. Not much, just a gray ribbon lifting above the trees. He had noticed it without meaning to at first. Then, after a while, he noticed it because he could not help himself. Widowers had habits they did not speak of. Some counted chairs at the table. Some kept dresses folded in trunks. Some watched other lonely chimneys in winter. That morning he had seen no smoke. By noon, still none. By dusk, the hills had vanished behind snow, but the thought stayed with him. Maybe her stovepipe was blocked. Maybe she had gone to town before the storm. Maybe she and the boy were sitting in some neighbor's kitchen, warm and fed. Maybe. Caleb set the cup down. Caleb did not answer. Amos looked toward the window. Ain't fit weather for a man to ride. No. Trail's buried. Yes. That mare won't make it. Take Samson if you're set on being foolish. Caleb turned from the glass. Amos sighed. You don't know they're there. No, Caleb said, but I don't know they ain't. That was the only answer he had. 10 minutes later, Caleb Rusk was in the barn pulling a saddle over the back of his strongest horse. Samson stamped once, uneasy from the wind beating against the doors. A lantern swung from a nail, throwing Caleb's shadow long and broken across the boards. His son, Ben, appeared at the barn entrance with his coat half-buttoned and fear trying hard to look like anger. "Pa, you can't ride in this." Caleb tightened the cinch. "Go back inside. Miss Clara's place is near 3 miles. I know where it is. You said no one rides in a whiteout unless the devil himself is chasing." Caleb paused and looked at him. Ben was 11, but grief had made him older in the eyes. He carried worry like a grown man and silence like a second coat. "Sometimes," Caleb said, "a man rides because he's afraid the devil got there first." Ben swallowed. Caleb pulled on his gloves and touched the boy's shoulder as he passed. It was not much. The Rusks were not a family rich in soft gestures since Alina died, but Ben leaned into that touch for half a breath and Caleb felt it. "Keep the fire high," Caleb said. "Watch your sister. If I'm not back by morning, Amos will know what to do." Ben's face went pale. Caleb hated himself for saying it, but he had learned that children deserved plainness more than comfort when danger came near the door. Then he led Samson into the storm. The cold hit like a wall. Snow swallowed man and horse before they had gone 50 yards. Caleb bent low in the saddle, one hand shielding his face, the other holding the reins with a grip that made his knuckles ache. Samson fought through drifts up to his chest. More than once, the horse stumbled, and Caleb thought they would both go down. He kept his mind fixed on one thing: a chimney without smoke. The ride that should have taken half an hour took nearly 3. Caleb lost the trail twice. He found it again by memory, by fence posts barely showing above snow, by the dark shape of pines he had passed in summer. His cheeks burned, then went numb. Ice formed on his beard. The lantern he carried under his coat bumped against his ribs like a second heart. When at last the Whitcomb cabin rose out of the white, Caleb knew before he reached it. No glow in the window. No smoke above the roof. No sound but wind. He slid from the saddle and nearly fell when his boots hit the drift. He fought his way to the door and pounded once. "Mrs. Whitcomb." The storm answered. He shoved the door. It would not move. Snow had packed hard against it from inside and out, and the frame had frozen solid. Caleb stepped back, lowered his shoulder, and drove himself into the wood. Once, twice. On the third blow, the door burst inward with a crack that echoed through the dead little cabin. The cold inside was worse than outside. That was how he knew. No fire, no breath of warmth, no life moving. Then he heard it. A small sound. Not a word, not quite a cry. Caleb lifted the lantern. In the narrow bed against the wall, Clara Whitcomb lay curled around her boy beneath a thin quilt, her face pale as candle wax, her lashes white with frost. Eli was tucked against her, still as a doll, one hand caught in the worn fabric of his mother's sleeve. For one terrible second, Caleb thought he had come too late. Then Clara's eyes opened just a little. She looked at him without understanding. "Joseph," she whispered. Caleb crossed the room in 2 strides, the lantern shaking in his hand. "No, ma'am," he said, his voice rough with cold and fear. "It's Caleb Rusk." Her lips moved. "Don't take my boy." That broke something in him. He dropped to his knees beside the bed and pulled off his gloves. Her hand was ice beneath his fingers. Eli's cheek was colder than any child's face should ever be. "I ain't taking him from you," Caleb said. "I'm taking you both to a fire." Clara tried to speak, but no sound came. Caleb wrapped Eli first, then Clara, in the heavy blankets he had brought tied behind the saddle. He moved fast, but not rough. Every second mattered, and still he found himself tucking the quilt around the boy's ears the way Alina used to tuck Ruth in on cold nights. The past rose up, sharp and sudden. His wife's empty bed. His daughter crying in the dark. His own failure to make a house feel whole. He pushed it down. There would be time for grief later if God allowed it. He carried Eli out first and set him against the saddle. Then he came back for Clara. She was light in his arms, too light, all bones and pride and frozen sorrow. As he lifted her, something slipped from beneath the pillow and fell to the floor. A folded letter. Caleb saw Joseph Whitcomb's name written across it, in a hand that trembled. He should have left it. Instead, he picked it up and tucked it inside his coat, not knowing why except that it felt like something she had held close when the cold came for her. Outside, the storm screamed. Caleb lifted Clara onto Samson, then climbed behind her with Eli braced before him under the blankets. The horse turned toward home as if he knew lives depended on every step. Behind them, the cabin door hung open in the blizzard. In Caleb's coat, the hidden letter warmed slowly against his chest. And before dawn touched the buried hills, the whole town of Mercy Creek would begin whispering about the widow in Caleb Rusk's house. Caleb Rusk reached the bar lantern just as the gray edge of morning began to show behind the storm clouds. Amos saw him from the barn and came running through the snow with a lantern held high. Ben opened the front door before the horse even stopped, and little Ruth stood behind him in her nightdress, clutching the rail of the stairs with both hands. Nobody spoke at first. The sight of Caleb bent in the saddle with a frozen woman against him, and a boy wrapped tight before him, was enough to silence any house. Ben, Caleb called, his voice hoarse. Open the bed in the front room. Ruth, fetch every quilt you can carry. Amos, get the doctor if the road lets you. Amos looked toward the white storm. Caleb looked back at him. Try. That was all. The old hand nodded once and turned for his horse. Caleb carried Eli inside first. The boy's head lolled against his shoulder, but there was breath in him, small, thin, still there. Caleb laid him close to the stove while Ben stood stiff nearby, his face drawn tight. Is he dead? Ruth whispered. No, Caleb said, and don't you say that word again in this room. Ruth's lower lip trembled, but she ran for the quilts. Clara came next. Caleb lifted her from the horse and carried her through the door as carefully as if she were made of glass. Snow clung to her hair and lashes. One hand hung loose over his arm, pale and still. When Ruth saw her, the child covered her mouth. Caleb laid Clara on the bed in the front room, the one nobody used anymore because it had been Alina's sick room near the end. For a breath, his hands froze above the blanket. That room still held memories he did not enter by choice. The faded curtains Alina had sewn. The chair where he had sat through long nights. The little blue pitcher Ruth used to bring water in. Ben noticed. He always noticed more than Caleb wished he did. Pa, the boy said quietly. Caleb came back to himself. More blankets. The house woke into urgent motion. Ruth brought quilts in a pile so high she could barely see over them. Ben fed the stove until the iron belly glowed red. Caleb warmed cloths, rubbed Eli's hands, then Clara's, careful not to move too fast. He remembered enough from winter rescues to know that heat could be a friend or an enemy depending on how it was given. Clara stirred once and whispered something. Caleb leaned close. Eli, she breathed. He's here, Caleb said. He's beside the fire, he's breathing. Her face twisted, not quite awake, not quite gone. Don't let them take him. No one is taking him. The words came out harder than he meant them to. By noon, Amos returned with Dr. Merton wrapped in a buffalo coat and cursing the weather under his breath. The doctor was a small man with silver spectacles and no patience for foolish pride, which made him useful in a county full of it. He checked Eli first, then Clara. He listened to their breathing, pressed fingers to wrists, lifted eyelids, and stood silent for a long moment. Well, Caleb asked. Dr. Merton looked toward the bed, then toward the boy near the stove. One more night in that cabin, and I'd be riding up there in spring with 2 pine boxes. Ruth made a small sound. Ben put his hand on her shoulder. Caleb looked down at his boots. Snow had melted off them and left dark puddles on the floorboards. But they may live, he asked. If they're kept warm, fed slow, and not moved, the boy will mend faster. Children sometimes do. The widow is worn down in more ways than weather. The doctor looked at Caleb over his spectacles. She stays here. Caleb gave a short nod. Dr. Merton snapped his bag shut. And I mean stays, not for a day. Not until some nosy soul decides it looks improper. She has no strength, and that cabin is not fit for a dog until the roof and stove are repaired. I know it. The doctor's eyes softened a little. I expect you do. That evening, Mercy Creek learned. Not because Caleb told them. He had no time for town talk. Amos had stopped at the livery on his way back with the doctor, and the livery man told his wife, and his wife told her sister, and before the lamps were lit, half the town knew that Clara Whitcomb and her boy had been found near frozen and carried into Caleb Rusk's house. By the next morning, the story had already started to change shape. Some said Caleb had broken into her cabin in the dead of night without asking. Some said Clara had planned to go to him all along. Some said a widower and a widow under one roof in winter was trouble dressed as charity. And some, though quieter, wondered why nobody else had thought to look for smoke. Mrs. Hattie Bell arrived first, because gossip with a basket on its arm can call itself kindness. She came wrapped in a brown wool cloak, her cheeks red from the cold, carrying a jar of preserves and a face full of concern. Caleb met her on the porch. The wind had settled, but the cold remained, bright and sharp. Icicles hung from the roof edge like teeth. "Mr. Rusk," Mrs. Bell said, peering past him toward the door. "I heard poor Mrs. Whitcomb is within." "She is." "And the boy?" "Sleeping." "Bless them, terrible thing, truly terrible." She shifted the basket in her hands. "I thought perhaps I might sit with her, or better yet, help arrange for her to be moved somewhere more suitable." Caleb did not move aside. "Suitable?" "Well," Mrs. Bell lowered her voice, though there was no one near enough to hear but the horse shifting in the barn. "A woman in your house, Caleb, a young widow, you being alone since Eleanor passed. Folks are bound to talk." "Folks are already talking." Her mouth tightened. "Then you understand the difficulty." "I understand the weather nearly killed her." "No one disputes that. But now that she's safe, the proper thing would be to place her with a family in town. Perhaps the church room, or Mrs. Pruett's back chamber." "The church room has no stove worth naming, and Mrs. Pruett's back chamber has a broken window." Mrs. Bell blinked. Still, appearances must be considered. Caleb looked out over the yard. The snow lay clean and smooth now, hiding every rut and stone. It made the world look gentler than it was. "Mrs. Bell," he said, "when I found Clara Whitcomb, her boy's face was cold enough to scare the breath clean out of me. Her stove was dead. Her wood was gone. Her cabin had snow through the roof. I carried them here because this house had fire in it." "I am not questioning your heart." "No," Caleb said quietly, "only whether I ought to have used it." Color rose in her cheeks. Inside the house, Ruth laughed softly at something Eli had murmured in his sleep. It was the first light sound Caleb had heard from that room. He glanced toward it, and his face changed just a little. Mrs. Bell saw that change and frowned as if it proved something. Caleb looked back at her. "She is not leaving." "Caleb, be sensible." "I am." "The town may not see it kindly." "Then the town can look harder." Mrs. Bell drew herself up. "A good name is not a small thing." "No," Caleb said, "it is not. That's why a man ought not trade his for cowardice." The words landed cold between them. Mrs. Bell clutched her basket. "I only came to help." "Then leave the preserves." For a moment it seemed she might argue. Instead, she placed the basket on the porch rail, turned with all the dignity she could gather, and marched back toward her wagon. Caleb watched her go. He did not enjoy being harsh. Eleanor had always said his silences were kinder than his words when his temper rose. But the image of Clara's frozen cabin still sat behind his eyes, and it left little room for polite foolishness. When he stepped back inside, the house smelled of wood smoke, broth, and damp wool. Eli lay near the stove with color slowly returning to his cheeks. Ruth sat on the floor beside him, showing him a little carved horse, speaking in a whisper as if loud words might break him. Ben stood near the doorway to the front room, watching Clara sleep. "She keeps asking for him," Ben said. "Eli." Ben shook his head. "Her husband." Caleb said nothing. "She thinks you're him sometimes." "That'll pass." "Does it hurt?" Caleb looked at his son. Ben's eyes were fixed on the bed, where Clara lay beneath Alina's old quilts. "What?" "When someone calls for the dead," Ben asked, "does it hurt them to hear no answer?" Caleb could not find a quick reply. He crossed the room and set another split log into the stove. "I reckon it hurts the living more," he said at last. That night, Clara woke fully for the first time. The lamps were low. Snow tapped softly against the window now, no longer wild but steady. Caleb sat in the chair beside the stove, his elbows on his knees, half asleep. Eli rested on a pallet near the warmth, breathing easier. Clara turned her head and saw her boy. A sound left her then, half sob and half prayer. Caleb rose. "Easy," he said. "You're safe." Her eyes moved around the room, confused and frightened. "Where am I?" "My house, Bar Lantern Ranch." She tried to sit up and failed. "I can't stay here." "You can tonight." "No," panic sharpened her voice. "No, Mr. Rusk, people will say." "They already have." She shut her eyes, shame washing over her face. Caleb stood at the foot of the bed, big hands hanging useless at his sides. He had pulled her from death, but he did not know how to pull her from disgrace. "I'll go in the morning," she whispered. "You won't." Her eyes opened. "My cabin has no dry wood, no sound roof, and a stove cracked near through. I can manage." The lie was thin and proud and familiar. Caleb looked at Eli, then back at her. "You nearly managed, both of you, into graves." The words hurt her. He saw it as soon as they left his mouth. Her face turned away, and her hand closed around the edge of the blanket with what little strength she had. He softened his voice. "Forgive me, that was cruel." "It was true," she said. Silence sat between them. Then Clara whispered, "I did not know how to ask." Caleb reached inside his coat to pull out his handkerchief, and his fingers brushed the folded letter he had taken from the cabin. He had forgotten it in the fear and rush. He drew it out slowly. "I found this by your bed," he said. Clara saw the handwriting and went still. All the blood seemed to leave her face again, but this time it was not from cold. "Give it to me," she said. Caleb stepped closer and placed it in her hand. Her fingers trembled around it as if it were alive. "What is it?" he asked before he could stop himself. Clara held the letter to her chest and stared toward the dark window. "The last thing Joseph wrote," she whispered, "and the one thing I prayed no one in Mercy Creek would ever read." Caleb did not ask again. He had learned, through sorrow and hard winters, that a letter held to a chest was sometimes the last door a person had. A decent man did not push it open just because curiosity knocked. Clara turned the folded paper in her hands. Her fingers were still weak, but they knew every crease. The letter had been opened and closed so often the edges had softened like cloth. She looked smaller with it, not because the room was big, but because memory had a way of making the living shrink beside the dead. "It's safe with you," Caleb said. She gave a bitter little breath. "Nothing is safe with me." The words were low, but they carried. From the pallet near the stove, Eli stirred. Clara froze, watching him, and only when the boy settled again did she breathe. Caleb saw then that her fear was not only for herself. It lived in every look she gave the child, every motion of her hand, every word she kept back. He moved toward the stove and poured warm water into a tin cup. "Drink." She obeyed because she had no strength to argue. Her hands shook so badly the cup rattled against her teeth, and Caleb had to steady it without touching her more than necessary. When she finished, she looked toward Eli. "He looks better." "He is." "Did he cry?" "Not much." A mother's pain crossed her face. "He knows not to." That simple sentence told Caleb more than any long confession could have. In the corner of the room, Alina's old clock ticked in the darkness. Caleb had not heard that sound in months, or maybe he had been hearing it all along and not listening. Since Alina died, the house had become a place of duties. Feed the children, feed the stock, mend the fence, pay the debts, keep breathing. He had done all of it, but none of it had made the walls feel less empty. Now a half-frozen widow lay in the sick room. Her boy slept by the stove, and trouble had come through his door wearing a woman's torn coat. Still, the house felt less dead than it had the day before. That scared him. Clara looked at the quilt over her knees. It was blue and cream, faded in places from years of use. Her thumb moved over a small patch near the edge. "Your wife made this." Caleb's throat tightened. "Yes. She had fine hands." "She did." The quiet stretched between them, not awkward, but heavy with names neither of them knew how to carry. Clara touched the stitches again. "My mother taught me. Quilting, I mean. I used to sew for families back in Missouri before Joseph brought us west." "Can you still?" Her eyes lifted. There was something like pride in them, buried but not dead. "A woman may lose a great many things, Mr. Rusk, her land, her husband, her good coat, her good name if the town is hungry enough, but the hands remember." Caleb almost smiled. "Then when you're stronger, maybe your hands can help mend what my children tear faster than I can keep up with." It was meant as a small kindness, a plank laid over deep water. Clara understood it that way. Her face eased a little. "I would like to earn my stay." "You do not have to earn being alive." She looked away. A person always pays somehow. Caleb had no answer for that. He wished he did. By morning, Mercy Creek had settled into a bright, frozen calm. The kind of day that made snow look holy and men forget how cruel it could be. Smoke lifted from every chimney in town. Wagons creaked along the main street. At Pruitt's Mercantile, the story of Clara Whitcomb had grown new teeth. By noon, some said Caleb had carried her over his threshold like a bride. By supper, some said she had been seen wearing one of Eleanor Rusk's shawls, as if that alone proved something shameful. And by the next day, Reverend Alcott's wife came to the ranch with a basket of bread and eyes full of worry she did not know how to hide. Caleb met her in the kitchen this time. Ruth was helping slice potatoes at the table, and Ben was outside breaking ice in the trough. Eli sat near the stove, wrapped in a blanket, watching everything with the quiet gaze of a child who had learned not to ask for too much. Mrs. Alcott was kinder than Mrs. Bell. That made her harder to turn away. "Caleb," she said softly, "no one questions that you did right bringing them here." "That's kind of no one." She lowered her eyes. "You know how people are." "I do, that's why I prefer cattle." Ruth gave a small laugh, then pressed her lips together when Mrs. Alcott looked at her. The Reverend's wife stepped closer. "There is talk of arranging a room behind the church. We could patch the stove. Several women might take turns sitting with Mrs. Whitcomb until she's fully recovered." Did several women take turns checking on her before the blizzard? The question struck the room still. Mrs. Alcott's face colored, but not with anger, with shame. "No," she said, "we did not." Eli looked down at his hands. Caleb regretted the sharpness for the boy's sake, but not the truth. "Mrs. Whitcomb stays until she can stand, walk, choose, and leave without dying for it," he said. "Not one day sooner. And if the town keeps talking, then let them wear out their tongues." Mrs. Alcott studied him with tired eyes. "You were always stubborn." "No, my wife was stubborn. I only learned from a master." That softened her. She had known Eleanor. Most of Mercy Creek had. They had brought pies and flowers and prayers when the fever took her. Then, as weeks became months, they had gone back to their own warm homes while Caleb stayed cold around two grieving children. Mrs. Alcott set the bread on the table. "I will tell the Reverend what you said." "Tell him the truth." "I will." When she left, Ruth watched through the window until the wagon disappeared behind the cottonwoods. "Pa," she asked, "is Miss Clara bad?" Caleb turned from the stove. "No." "Then why do folks talk like she is?" Eli's shoulders drew up under the blanket. Caleb saw it and crossed to the table. He knelt so his eyes were level with Ruth's, though his words were for both children. Sometimes people would rather talk about what looks wrong than face what they failed to do right. Ruth frowned. "That don't make sense." "No," Caleb said, "it doesn't." From the doorway, Clara spoke. "It makes sense to grown folks who are afraid." Everyone turned. She stood with one hand against the frame, pale and unsteady, wrapped in Eleanor's faded shawl because it was the warmest thing Ruth had found. Her hair had been combed back, though loose strands still fell near her cheeks. She looked ashamed to be seen standing, ashamed to be weak, ashamed to need the doorframe beneath her palm. Eli scrambled up. "Mama." She opened her arm, and he ran carefully to her, as if afraid he might hurt her by holding too tight. Clara bent around him, closing her eyes when his face pressed against her waist. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth slipped from her chair and picked up the carved horse she had been showing Eli. "You can have this while you're here," she said. Eli looked at it as if it were gold. "I can." "Only while you're here," Ruth added, trying to sound stern. "He's named Captain." Eli took the horse with both hands. "I'll take good care of him." Ruth nodded, satisfied. Clara watched the exchange, and something in her face almost broke. A small kindness can be more dangerous to pride than cruelty. Cruelty gives a person something to stand against. Kindness asks them to lay their weapons down. "I should not be wearing this," Clara said, touching the shawl. Ruth looked confused. "It's warm." "It was your mother, S." "My mother liked people warm," Ruth said simply. Caleb looked away. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, Clara came into the kitchen with slow steps and sat at the table. Caleb was mending a harness strap by lamplight. He did not tell her to go back to bed, though he wanted to. He had begun to understand that telling Clara Whitcomb what she was too weak to do only made her prove otherwise. "You asked about the letter," she said. Caleb set the strap down. "I did, then I wished I hadn't." "You had cause. You found me near dead with it under my pillow. A man might wonder." He waited. Clara folded her hands on the table. A small tremble still lived in them. "Joseph wrote it 2 weeks before he died. He was fevered by then, but his mind cleared near the end. He told me there was money owed on the claim, more than he had admitted. He had borrowed against the land from Sela's Creed." Caleb's eyes sharpened. Sela's Creed owned the freight office, half the feed store, and enough private debts around Mercy Creek to make honest men speak gently in his presence. He had a smooth voice and a clean collar, and the kind of smile that never reached where Mercy ought to be. "How much?" Caleb asked. "Enough that if I missed the winter payment, he could take the land come spring." "Why hide that?" Her mouth tightened. "Because there was more." She reached into the pocket of the shawl and drew out the letter. For a moment, Caleb thought she would hand it to him. Instead, she held it flat beneath her palm. Joseph wrote that Sela's had tricked him on the terms, that the paper he signed was not the paper they had agreed on. Joseph was too sick to fight it by then. He begged me to take it to the judge in Helena. "Did you?" Her eyes filled, though no tear fell. "With what money, on what horse? Leaving Eli with whom?" She swallowed. "So I stayed. I told myself I would make enough by winter. I told myself I would find a way before spring. Then the snow came, and I had not even found courage enough to tell one soul." Caleb leaned back slowly. The room seemed colder despite the stove. "Does Creed know you have that letter?" Clara nodded. "How?" "He came to the cabin 3 days before the storm. He said Joseph owed more than I knew. He said if I handed over the letter, he might be generous when the thaw came." Caleb's jaw set. "And you refused." "I burned the last good chair after he left, not because I needed the wood that night." She looked down at her hands. "Because my knees were shaking so badly I could not stand to look at it. He sat in that chair and told me a widow with no money should learn when to be grateful for any offer a man makes." The harness strap creaked under Caleb's tightening fist. Clara saw his anger and shook her head. "Do not go after him." "I haven't moved." "He was." She pressed the letter closer. "If this becomes a fight, Mercy Creek will believe him before it believes me. He is a man of business. I am a widow found under your roof." Caleb looked toward the dark window. Outside, a horse shifted in the barn. The lantern by the door flickered in a small draft. Somewhere upstairs, Ruth murmured in her sleep. Then came a sound from the porch. One slow knock. Caleb rose at once. Clara's face went white. At that hour in that cold, no neighbor came calling for bread. Caleb took the lantern and opened the door only as wide as his shoulder. Sela's Creed stood on the porch in a fine black coat, snow shining on the brim of his hat. Behind him, 2 men waited near a wagon. His smile was calm and clean. "Evening, Mr. Rusk," he said. "I've come for property that belongs to me." Caleb did not step aside. The porch lantern swung in the wind, throwing light across Silas Creed's face. It was a handsome face if a person did not look too long. Smooth cheeks, neatly trimmed beard, eyes pale and patient like a man who had never once doubted the world would move for him if he waited with enough coldness. Behind Caleb, Clara stood in the kitchen with Joseph's letter clutched against her skirts. Eli had woken and come silently to the doorway, the carved horse still in his hand. Caleb felt the boy there without turning. "What property?" Caleb asked. Silas smiled. "No need for theater. Mrs. Whitcomb has a paper that concerns a debt owed to me. Her late husband signed lawful terms. I have been patient, but patience can be mistaken for weakness by desperate people. You come to collect papers from a sick woman in the middle of the night. I came because I heard the sick woman had recovered enough to stand in your kitchen and spread old lies." Silas looked past Caleb. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitcomb." Clara did not answer. Silas's smile sharpened. "You look better than expected." Caleb shifted, blocking his view. "You're done speaking to her." "Am I?" Silas gave a soft laugh. "This is your house, Rusk, not your courthouse." "No, which is why I can tell you to get off my porch without waiting for a judge." The two men near the wagon straightened. They were not town deputies. Caleb knew them. Harlan Pike and Morris Vane, rough teamsters who sometimes hauled freight for Silas and sometimes did work best not asked about. Neither reached for a weapon, but both wore sidearms in plain sight. Silas lifted one gloved hand. "No need for temper, I am here peaceably." "At night with hired men. The roads are dangerous." "So is greed," Caleb said. For the first time, a crack showed in Silas Creed's calm. It passed quickly, but Caleb saw it. Silas leaned a little closer. "Careful, you have already invited enough talk by keeping another man's widow under your roof." Caleb's eyes did not move. "The next man who says that on my porch will say it from the snow." Silas's gaze dropped briefly to Caleb's hands. Then he stepped back with a mild shrug, as if he had won something by proving Caleb could be angered. Inside, Clara took a small step forward. "Mr. Creed," she said, her voice weak but clear, "Joseph's letter is mine." Silas turned his head. "Your husband owed me money." "My husband said you changed the terms." Fever makes men confused. "He wrote it when his mind was clear." "How lucky for you that a dead man can speak only through paper held by a widow who benefits from his accusation." Silas sighed. "Think carefully, Clara. A court will ask why you hid this letter all winter. It will ask why you did not bring it forward at once. It will ask why you are now in the home of a man who might gain by helping you keep that land." Caleb heard Eli's breathing change. Silas heard it too. His eyes moved toward the boy. "That claim is poor," Silas said softly. "Hardly worth the pain you are putting your child through. Sign it over when the thaw comes, hand me the letter now, and I may forgive the remaining debt. You could go to town, take laundry, sew shirts, live quietly." Clara's hand tightened around the letter. Caleb wanted to close the door in Silas's face, but he could feel the deeper danger. Silas had not come only for paper. He had come to plant fear. He had come to remind Clara that truth without strength beside it could be crushed under a polished boot. Then Ben's voice came from the stairs. "You ought to leave." Everyone looked. Ben stood halfway down, barefoot, his shirt untucked, his face pale with sleep and fury. Ruth was behind him, small and wide-eyed. Silas's smile returned. "Your children keep late hours." Caleb spoke without turning. "Ben, take your sister back upstairs." "No." The word hit the room hard. Ben had disobeyed before in quiet ways, as boys do, but never like that, never in front of a stranger. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Son." Ben came down 2 more steps. "He talks like he owns everybody, he don't." Silas raised his brows. "A brave boy." Ben's hands curled at his sides. "My ma used to say men who smile while hurting folks are the worst kind." The porch went silent. Caleb turned then, not angry now, but struck. Ben had barely spoken of a leaner in over a year, not more than a word here or there, and always with his eyes fixed elsewhere. Silas's expression cooled. "Teach your son manners, Rusk." I did, Caleb said. That's what you're hearing. For a few breaths, the only sound was wind brushing snow across the porch boards. Silas stepped back at last. Very well, keep the letter tonight, Mrs. Whitcomb. Sleep beside it if that comforts you. But spring comes to every valley. When the road opens, debts open with it. He turned, then paused. One more thing. Charity is a fragile cover. Once people begin asking what was done behind a closed winter door, even good men can find their names stained past washing. Caleb's voice was low. My name will stand what it has to. But will hers? Silas looked past him one last time, not at Clara now, but at Eli. Then he went down the steps. Harlan and Morris climbed into the wagon, and the three men disappeared into the pale, frozen dark. Caleb stayed at the door until the sound of wheels faded. When he closed it, the kitchen seemed smaller. Ruth began to cry, silently at first, then with little broken breaths. Ben stood stiff, ashamed now of his own boldness. Eli stared at the floor, still clutching Captain the carved horse so hard his knuckles turned white. Clara moved toward him, but her strength failed. She caught the chair back. Caleb stepped forward, then stopped himself, letting her decide whether help would wound more than steady. She reached Eli and knelt with effort. Look at me, she whispered. The boy shook his head. Eli. He looked up, and his eyes were full of a fear too old for 8 years. Did Pa do something bad? He asked. Clara's face crumpled for half a second before she gathered herself. No, your father was tired and trusting, and Mr. Creed used that. Will he take our land? Not if truth has any weight left in this county. The answer was brave, but Caleb heard the uncertainty beneath it. Ben came to stand near them. Pa will help. Clara glanced up. Caleb saw the protest forming. Pride, shame, fear of owing too much. He had seen it in her from the first hour. Before she could speak, Ruth wiped her nose with her sleeve and said, And I will too. You, Ben asked. Ruth lifted her chin. I can listen. Grown folks forget children listen. That drew a tired, unexpected laugh from Amos, who had appeared from the back room holding a lantern and an old shotgun he clearly hoped no one noticed. Child ain't wrong, Amos muttered. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face. Everybody back to bed. No one moved. He sighed, fine, everybody sit. They gathered around the kitchen table like a family called together by storm and threat. Clara sat with Eli close against her. Ruth climbed onto the bench beside him. Ben stood behind his chair, too restless to sit. Amos leaned near the stove. Caleb poured coffee he did not want and set water to warm for the children. The letter lay in the middle of the table. Clara had put it there herself. Its presence changed the room. For days she had held it as if it belonged only to her grief. Now it sat where others could see the worn paper, the careful fold, the faint stain near the corner that might have been fever, sweat, or tears. Caleb did not touch it. Clara looked at him. You may read it. He shook his head. Not unless you ask me to. I am asking. Still, he hesitated. So Clara unfolded it herself, smoothing it with both hands. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied as she read Joseph's words. The letter told of the debt, of Silas bringing one agreement to the cabin and another to be signed. It told how Joseph had been weak, ashamed, and afraid of disappointing his wife. It told how he had meant to speak sooner but waited until sickness made honesty his last labor. Then Clara reached the final lines, and her voice broke. Clara, if I leave you with ruin, forgive me. Do not let shame bury you with me. Ask help from someone good before pride costs you and Eli more than land. She stopped. No one breathed for a moment. Then Eli whispered, Pa knew. Clara covered her mouth. He knew you needed help, the boy asked. She nodded, tears slipping down now. Why didn't you? It was not cruel, that made it hurt worse. Clara reached for him, but Eli stood and stepped back. Confusion filled his small face. Not anger yet, something sadder. The first crack in a child's belief that his mother could keep every danger away by loving him enough. I thought I was protecting you, she said. But we almost died. The words fell soft and terrible. Ruth looked down at the carved horse in Eli's hand. Ben stared at the stove. Amos cleared his throat and turned away. Clara bowed her head. "Yes," she whispered, "we did." Eli's lip trembled. He looked as if he wanted to run to her and away from her both. At last he did neither. He walked to the stove, sat on the rug, and held the wooden horse to his chest. Clara stayed frozen in her chair. Caleb had seen men break bones, lose cattle, bury kin, but he had rarely seen pain as quiet as a mother watching her child step out of reach. He folded the letter carefully and set it back before her. "Tomorrow," he said, "I'll ride to Judge Bellamy's place if the road holds." Clara wiped her face. "No, you have done enough." "I haven't. Caleb." The use of his first name stilled him. She seemed to realize it too, and color touched her pale cheeks. He spoke gently. "Joseph asked you to seek help from someone good. I won't claim to be that, but I can ride a horse through bad weather, and I know when a man is trying to steal from a widow." Amos grunted. "That's more than some judges know." Ben looked at his father. "I'll go with you." "No." This time Ben did not argue, but the hurt showed. Caleb saw it. He remembered Ben standing on the stairs, speaking Aliner's name like a shield. He remembered how long the boy had been waiting for something worth fighting for. "We'll talk in the morning," Caleb said. It was not a promise, but it was not a closed door either. Later, after everyone had gone back to bed, Clara remained at the kitchen table. Caleb found her there near midnight, the lamp low, Joseph's letter open again beneath her hand. "You should rest," he said. He was scared. He was right. Caleb sat across from her. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It had weight now. Shared danger had given it shape. "I thought pride was all I had left," Clara said. "After Joseph died, after the neighbors stopped coming, after the money ran thin, I thought if I could just stand straight, if I could just never ask, then I would not be pitied." Caleb looked at the worn table, at the knife marks and burn rings Aliner used to scold him for making. "Pride can keep a person standing," he said, "but it makes a poor blanket." Clara gave a tired smile through tears. "That sounds like something a man learns the hard way." "It is." She looked at him then, truly looked, and for a moment they both seemed to understand that the cold had not only lived in her cabin. It had lived in this house too, in closed rooms and unsaid names and children who spoke too little. A soft cry came from upstairs. "Ruth." Caleb stood, but Clara rose too. "You're weak," he said. "I know that." She held the table until the room steadied. Then she looked toward the stairs. "But I know something about children crying for what cannot come back." Caleb should have told her no. Instead, he lifted the lamp, and together they climbed the stairs toward the sound of his daughter's grief, not knowing that by morning Mercy Creek would have a new rumor waiting, and this one would be harder to survive than the storm. Ruth's room was cold at the corners, even with the small stove pipe running through the wall. Caleb held the lamp high as Clara stepped inside behind him. The child sat upright in bed, her hair loose around her face, both fists tangled in the quilt. She was not sobbing loudly. Ruth almost never did. Her grief came in tight little breaths, like she was trying to swallow something too large for her. Ben stood in the doorway of his own room, watching. "I'm sorry," Ruth whispered when she saw her father. "I didn't mean to wake you." Caleb sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress dipped under his weight. "You don't apologize for crying." Ruth looked at him in confusion, as if she had been told different by the silence of the house. Clara stayed near the wall, one hand resting lightly against the dresser. She did not come close. She did not pretend to belong. She only waited with the lamp glow touching the side of her face. Ruth's eyes moved to her. "I dreamed Mama was at the foot of the stairs." Caleb's throat worked, but no words came. "She had her blue dress on," Ruth said. "The one with the little white flowers. I tried to go to her, but she kept walking away. Then I woke up and it was just dark." Clara's eyes softened. "That kind of dream can ache worse than no dream at all," she said. Ruth wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. "Do you dream of Mr. Whitcomb?" "Sometimes." "Does he walk away too?" Clara looked down. No, he mostly stands where I cannot reach him. Ruth thought about that. Caleb watched the two of them with a strange tightness in his chest. Since Alina died, he had believed sorrow was something best handled by keeping the stove lit, the children fed, and the day moving. He had not known what to do with Ruth's night cries except sit beside her until they passed. He had not known how to speak to Ben's quiet anger except give him work. Clara, weak enough to sway where she stood, had done more with 3 gentle sentences than he had done with 2 years of silence. Ruth touched the quilt under her hands. This was Mama S2. Yes, Caleb said. Why is all her best things put away? The question struck him still. Ben stepped fully into the doorway now, his eyes fixed on Caleb. Clara turned her face toward the dark window, giving him privacy though there was nowhere private to go. Caleb rested his elbows on his knees. The lamp flame trembled. I put them away because looking hurt, he said at last. Ruth's voice grew small, but not looking hurts too. Ben looked down at the floor. Caleb closed his eyes for one moment. He saw Alina standing in that blue dress by the kitchen table, flour on her sleeve, laughing because Ruth had spilled molasses on the cat. He saw the dress folded in a cedar trunk in the loft, shut away with her shawls and ribbons and Sunday gloves. He had told himself he was preserving them. Maybe he had only buried them twice. I reckon you're right, he said. Ruth leaned against him then, and he put his arm around her. Clara slipped from the room without a sound. Caleb looked up just as she went, and for a heartbeat he wanted to call her back. Not because Ruth still needed her, because he did. That frightened him more than he liked. By morning, the new roomer had arrived before the sun cleared the pines. Amos brought it in with an armload of wood and a face like he had bitten into something sour. Town, saying Mrs. Whitcomb was seen going upstairs last night. Clara, standing at the stove, went still. Ben slammed his cup down. She went to help Ruth. Folks ain't telling it that way, Amos said. Caleb set his fork beside his plate with slow care. Who started it? Who do you think? Silas Creed did not have to speak every lie himself. Men like him planted one word in the right ear and let smaller minds do the watering. Clara's face had lost color again. Eli sat near her, still not quite close enough to touch. Since the night before, he had been careful with her, polite, obedient, but a small distance had opened between mother and son, and Clara felt every inch of it. I should go, she said. No, Caleb and Ben said together. The sound surprised them both. Clara turned. You heard Amos. My staying here gives Mr. Creed a weapon. Creed had a weapon before you crossed my door, Caleb said. He just changed the handle. But your children. My children know the truth. Truth does not always travel as fast as shame. Amos grunted from the woodbox. That's God's own fact. Caleb shot him a look, and Amos held up both hands. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter. It was Alina's shawl. That made the whole thing worse. I have lived poor, she said. I have lived hungry. I have lived afraid. But I will not be the reason your wife's name is dragged through town. Caleb stood then. The room quieted. Alina's name is not so weak that kindness can stain it. Clara's lips parted, but no answer came. He looked at Ruth and Ben, then at Eli, who watched him with troubled eyes. This house has been cold a long while, Caleb said, his voice rough. Not because there was no wood, because I did not know how to let the living touch what grief had claimed. Last night you helped my daughter speak of her mother without fear. If Mercy Creek calls that shameful, then Mercy Creek has forgotten what decency is. Ben's face changed. A little pride entered it, quiet but strong. Ruth slid her small hand into Clara's. Clara looked down at it, startled. Eli saw. The boy looked at his mother's hand in Ruth's, then at his own hands curled in his lap. He did not move, but something in his face softened with confusion. That same afternoon, Judge Bellamy came to the bar Lantern. He arrived in a black sleigh pulled by 2 gray horses, wrapped in a fur collar, his white beard tucked into his coat. Caleb had been preparing to ride to him, but the judge had received a message from Dr. Merton, who had carried more than medicine back to town. The doctor might be small, but his words moved through Mercy Creek with more weight than gossip when he chose to use them. Judge Bellamy stepped into the kitchen, stamped snow from his boots, and looked first at Clara. "Mrs. Whitcomb," he said, removing his hat, "I knew your father when he drove freight out of Independence, honest man, stubborn as a mule." Clara blinked. "You knew my father." "Lost 2 wagon wheels in the same creek and blamed the creek both times." His eyes softened. "You have his chin." For reasons Caleb did not understand, that nearly undid her. The judge sat at the kitchen table and read Joseph's letter. He read it once, then again. The room waited in silence. The only sound was the stove shifting and the wind nudging snow against the windows. At last he folded the paper. "This letter matters," he said. Clara breathed out. "But it is not enough by itself." Her shoulders sank. Caleb leaned forward. "Why not?" "Because Joseph Whitcomb is gone, and Sela's creed will claim fever, confusion, grief, or forgery if pressed. We need the original loan paper Joseph thought he signed, or a witness who saw the terms discussed before Creed changed them." "There was no witness," Clara said. Judge Bellamy tapped the folded letter against the table. "There may have been. Men like Creed often use clerks, teamsters, or notaries. Somebody copied something. Somebody carried something. Somebody heard something they did not know mattered." Amos scratched his beard. "Harlan Pike was with Creed on and off that season." "Harlan would lie for a bottle and $2, Caleb said. "Then we find someone who lies cheaper for the truth," the judge replied dryly. Ruth giggled before catching herself. Judge Bellamy's expression warmed for a moment, then grew serious again. "Mrs. Whitcomb, until this matter is settled, do not let that letter out of your possession. Make a copy tonight. Hide the original somewhere no one will think to look." Clara nodded. "I also advise you not to remain alone, anywhere Creed can reach you quietly." Her eyes flicked toward Caleb. The judge noticed. "I am not blind to what the town is saying." Clara's face tightened with shame. Judge Bellamy leaned back and looked around the kitchen. His gaze moved over Ben's wary face, Ruth's hand still near Clara's sleeve, Eli by the stove, Amos in the corner, and Caleb standing like a fence post that had chosen a side. "Let them say what they please," the judge said. "A rumor is not a law." "It can still ruin a woman," Clara said. "Yes," he answered gently. "Which is why you must decide whether you want to survive by hiding from lies or standing where lies can be answered." That sentence stayed in the room long after he left. If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because the truth in Mercy Creek has only begun to open. That evening, Clara asked Caleb for scraps. He found her in the front room, sitting by the fire with Joseph's letter copied in her careful hand and the original tucked into the small sewing basket she had carried from her cabin. The basket looked poor and worn, but her hand rested on it with fierce tenderness. "Scraps?" Caleb asked. "Cloth, old shirts, torn dresses, anything no longer useful." He raised one brow. "You planning to sew your way through a land dispute?" "I am planning to stop sitting like a ghost in your sick room." There it was again. That small ember of pride, not the kind that killed, but the kind that kept a soul from going out. Caleb led her to the storage room, where a trunk of worn household things sat beneath a shelf. There were old flour sacks, torn shirts, children's clothes outgrown at elbows and knees, and a brown wool skirt Alina had meant to cut down before sickness took her. Clara knelt slowly, touching each piece as if it had a voice. "These will do," she said. "For what?" "A quilt for Eli first. He lost his blanket in the cabin." Her voice wavered. "And perhaps one for Ruth if she'll allow me." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "Ruth would sleep under a horse blanket if you told her it was made kindly." Clara smiled, faint but real. Then her hand stopped on a folded piece of blue cotton at the bottom of the trunk. Caleb knew it before she lifted it. Alina's blue dress. The one with little white flowers. The one Ruth had dreamed about. The air changed. Clara drew her hand back at once. "I'm sorry." Caleb could not speak. The dress lay there between them, harmless as cloth and sharp as a grave. Clara closed the trunk gently. "I should not have looked." He nodded once, but not because he blamed her, because his throat was too tight for anything else. That night, long after the house slept, Caleb climbed to the loft with a lantern. The cedar trunk sat beneath the slanted roof, covered in dust. He opened it and saw Alina's life folded inside: dresses, shawls, aprons, a ribbon Ruth used to tie around her mother's wrist, a shirt Ben had torn and Alina had promised to mend. Caleb sat there a long while, surrounded by what he had hidden. Below, faint through the floorboards, came the soft sound of Clara moving by the fire, setting her first stitches. He lifted the blue dress. For the first time in 2 years, he held it without shutting the trunk again. And in the morning, when Clara came into the kitchen, she found the dress folded on the table beside her sewing basket, with Caleb standing at the window and Ruth staring at the cloth like she had seen a ghost come home. Ruth did not touch the blue dress at first. She stood beside the kitchen table in her bare feet, staring at it with both hands pressed to her nightgown. Morning light came thin through the frosted window, pale and silver, and it made the little white flowers on the cotton look almost alive. Clara stopped in the doorway. Caleb stood by the window with his back half turned, jaw tight, as if he had carried a heavy beam through the night and was waiting to see if the house would hold. Ben came in from outside with snow on his boots and a pail of milk in one hand. He saw the dress and froze. No one spoke. Even Eli, sitting near the stove with Captain the carved horse in his lap, seemed to understand that the cloth on the table was not just cloth. Ruth looked at Caleb. "Pa." Caleb cleared his throat, but his voice still came rough. "Your mother wore it the spring before the fever." "I know. She liked that dress." "I know." His fingers curled against the window ledge. "Mrs. Whitcomb makes warm things out of pieces folks don't know what to do with anymore." Clara's eyes lowered. "Only if you're certain." Caleb turned then. There was pain in his face, but not the locked-up kind Clara had seen before. This pain had a door open in it. "I ain't certain of much," he said. "But I know Ruth dreamed of her mother walking away in that dress. I know Ben won't say her name unless anger pulls it out of him. And I know keeping Alina folded in a trunk has not brought her one step closer." Ruth reached out one small hand, then stopped just above the cotton. "If it's cut," she whispered, "will Mama be gone more?" Clara came to the table slowly and knelt so she was not towering over the child. "No, sweetheart, cloth does not hold all of a person. Nothing on this earth can. But sometimes a dress can hold a morning, a song, the way she stood by a window, the color your eyes remember when you miss her." Ruth's mouth trembled. "If we cut it kindly," Clara said, "and sew it into something made for you, it will not be a dress shut away from the light. It will be warmth you can keep close." Ben set the milk pail down. "What about me?" he asked, and his voice sounded angry, though his eyes did not. Clara looked up at him. "If your father allows, I would make one for you too." "I don't need a baby quilt." "No," Clara said gently. "You need something stronger." Ben looked away fast. Caleb watched his son and saw the boy he had been losing by inches. Work had made Ben useful. Grief had made him hard. Neither had made him whole. "There are more things in the trunk," Caleb said. "Her green shawl, her brown work dress, aprons, pieces enough." Ruth finally touched the blue cotton. She pressed 2 fingers against one white flower. "I remember her singing in it," she said. Ben swallowed. "She wore the brown dress when she taught me to curry Daisy." Caleb's eyes closed. Clara stayed still, letting the memories come without hurrying them. She knew the first opening of grief could be like opening a winter door. Too much wind at once could drive a person back into hiding. After breakfast, Caleb brought down the cedar trunk. He did it himself. The trunk was heavier than it looked, or maybe the weight was in what it carried. He set it in the front room near the fire. Dust rose when the lid opened, smelling faintly of cedar, lavender, and years no one had dared enter. Ruth knelt on one side. Ben stood on the other, arms crossed. Eli hovered near Clara, still uncertain with his mother but drawn to the quiet work of her hands. Clara lifted each garment and asked before setting it aside. "This shawl?" Ruth nodded. "This apron?" Ben looked at it for a long time. "She wore that for biscuits." "Then biscuits belong in it," Clara said. He frowned. How do you sew biscuits into a quilt? You sew in the memory of them. Brown near the corner, maybe. A square for the kitchen. A bit of flour sack beside it. Quilts can speak plain if you let them. Ruth leaned closer. Can mine have the blue flowers near my face? Yes. And Ben's can have the brown dress because he likes horses. Ben scowled. I didn't say I liked anything. Ruth ignored him, the way sisters do when they know the truth better than words. For the first time since Clara had come to the bar lantern, the house did not feel like it was holding its breath. The fire snapped. The children argued softly over memories. Eli asked what a quilting frame looked like. Amos wandered in, claimed he only wanted coffee, then sat for half an hour watching Clara sort cloth as if she were performing a church service. By noon, Clara had chalked the first pieces. Her hands shook from weakness but less than before. She cut slowly with respect. No cloth was wasted. No memory treated careless. Ruth sat close enough for her knee to touch Clara's skirt. Ben pretended not to watch, but every time scissors neared a piece he remembered, his eyes followed. Caleb remained near the doorway. He could not sit, not yet. Each snip of the scissors went through him, not cruelly but deep. He had expected to feel like he was losing Alina again. Instead, with each piece laid open on the table, he remembered something he had forgotten. Alina laughing at rain through a leaky roof. Alina scolding him for tracking mud across a clean floor. Alina holding Ben on her hip when he was small enough to fit there. Alina singing Ruth to sleep with one hand moving through her hair. Not gone more. Nearer. That realization made Caleb turn away. Clara saw but said nothing. By late afternoon, Dr. Merton stopped by to check on Clara and Eli. He found the front room covered in neat stacks of cloth and stood blinking like he had walked into a tailor's shop after a windstorm. Well, he said, setting down his bag. Some folks recover by resting, others by taking apart a dead woman's wardrobe. The room went silent. The doctor looked around, realized what he had said, and winced. Ruth lifted her chin. Mama ain't dead in the wardrobe anymore. Dr. Merton removed his spectacles and polished them with great care. Then I stand corrected, Miss Ruth. Clara bit back a smile. The doctor checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, and declared her still too thin, still too stubborn, but less likely to fall over than yesterday. Eli he praised for color in his cheeks, though he warned him not to run outside like a wild colt until his lungs were stronger. Before leaving, Dr. Merton pulled Caleb aside on the porch. The town is restless, he said. Caleb looked toward Mercy Creek, hidden beyond the trees. Town can tire itself out. It may not. Sela's creed spoke with Reverend Alcott this morning. About what? Morality, debt, widows, children, and the dangerous example of your household. In that order, I believe. Caleb's face hardened. The doctor lowered his voice. He is trying to make this about Clara's character before anyone can make it about his papers. I figured. Judge Bellamy is asking questions, quietly. That means Creed will grow less quiet. Behind them, through the window, Clara leaned over the table while Ruth watched her place 2 blue squares together. Eli sat near them. Ben stood with one hand on the back of Clara's chair, pretending he was only looking at the fire. Dr. Merton followed Caleb's gaze. She has done something to this house, he said. Caleb did not answer. Be sure you know what you're protecting, Rusk. I'm protecting a woman and a boy from a thief. Yes, the doctor put on his hat, and perhaps more than that. Caleb looked at him sharply, but Dr. Merton was already stepping into the snow. That evening, the first real quilting began. Caleb had dragged Alina's old frame from the loft and tightened the pegs. Clara ran her hand along the wood as if greeting an old friend. The frame was set near the fire, where lamplight fell warm across the cloth. Ruth was allowed to make a few stitches in a practice scrap. Eli sat beside her, his tongue caught between his teeth as he tried to thread a needle and failed 3 times. At last, Clara guided his hand. He stiffened at her touch. She felt it, so did Caleb. The room seemed to pause. Clara did not hold him tighter, she only waited. Eli looked at their hands, his small fingers beneath hers. I was mad, he whispered. Clara's face trembled. I know. I'm still some mad. I know that too. His eyes filled. But I got scared when Mr. Creed came. I thought he'd take the letter and then pause land and then maybe you'd stop fighting. Clara bent her head close to his. I should have told you more truth, not all of it because children should not have to carry grown trouble, but enough that you knew I was not just waiting for the dark. Eli swallowed. Did Pa really write to ask for help? Yes. Then maybe he sent Mr. Rusk. The word struck Clara so hard she could not speak. Caleb looked down at the floor. Eli leaned, just a little, into his mother's side. That small movement was enough. Clara closed her eyes, not daring to hold him too quickly. Then slowly her arm came around him. Ruth watched them with solemn approval. Ben turned away, wiping at his nose with his sleeve, though he did not have a cold. The days that followed settled into a rhythm the house had not known in years. Morning chores, doctor's broth, children's lessons at the table when snow kept them indoors, Caleb and Amos tending stock, Clara stitching by the fire, strength returning inch by inch. At night, the children gathered near the quilting frame and memories came out with the scraps. The blue dress became Ruth's center squares. The brown work dress became Ben's corners. A strip of green shawl ran through both quilts like a meadow remembered under snow. Clara did not speak often of Joseph during those hours, but when she did, she spoke honestly. Not as a saint, not as a failure. As a man who had loved them, erred badly, and tried at the end to leave truth behind. Eli listened. So did Caleb. Something was changing between the two grown people by that fire, not quickly, not in a way either would name. It lived in quiet things. Caleb setting a cup of coffee beside Clara before she asked. Clara saving the heel of warm bread because she noticed he liked it. Their eyes meeting over the children's heads when Ruth laughed. The silence after, full of all the words grief would not yet permit. But Mercy Creek did not soften with the house. A week later, Mrs. Pruitt arrived with a bolt of muslin Clara had ordered on credit months before. She brought it herself, though her son usually delivered. Her face was tight, and she would not sit. I thought you should know, she said, glancing from Clara to Caleb. There is to be a church meeting after Sunday service. Caleb set down the harness buckle he had been repairing. For what purpose? Mrs. Pruitt looked miserable. Mr. Creed has asked that the congregation address the scandal before it harms the town's moral standing. Clara's hands stilled on the quilt. Ruth's needle stopped mid-stitch. Ben's face went dark. What scandal? Mrs. Pruitt looked at him, then away. Caleb stood, say it plain. She swallowed. They mean to call on Mrs. Whitcomb to leave your house at once, and if she refuses, they may ask the church to turn from her. The words fell like cold ash. Clara slowly set her needle down. Eli moved closer to her side. Caleb looked toward the half-finished quilts, toward the children sitting under pieces of their mother's memory, toward Clara's pale but steady face. Then he turned back to Mrs. Pruitt. Tell them we'll be there. Clara's eyes flew to him. Caleb, she said softly. He did not look away from the door. No more letting men talk about you in rooms where you ain't standing. Outside, the wind moved across the yard, carrying loose snow and white ribbons. And on the quilt frame, Eliner's blue flowers waited under Clara's needle, half made into warmth and half caught in the shape of a coming fight. Sunday morning came bright, cold, and sharp enough to make every sound carry. The church bell in Mercy Creek rang across the valley with a clean iron voice. It called families from warm houses, from barns, from wagons creaking over packed snow. It called children in stiff collars and mothers with gloved hands. It called men who had spent the week speaking in low voices at the mercantile, then straightened their coats as if a church door could make whispers holy. At the bar lantern, no one moved quickly. Clara stood before the small mirror in the front room, pinning her hair with hands that did not quite obey her. She wore a plain gray dress Mrs. Pruitt had sent with the muslin, likely out of guilt more than courage. It hung loose on Clara's still thin frame, but it was clean, and she had brushed it until it looked almost fine. Eli sat on the edge of the bed, polishing his boots with an old rag. He had not complained once that morning. That worried Clara more than if he had cried. You do not have to come, she said. He looked up. Yes, I do. You are a child. I'm your child. There was no arguing with that. Clara crossed to him and knelt, though the motion still pulled at her weakness. There may be hard words. I heard hard words before. Her eyes filled. She touched his cheek, and this time he did not pull away. I wish you had not. Eli looked down at his boot. If they say you did wrong by staying here, I'm going to tell them I was cold. Clara's breath caught. Clara pressed her lips together. I don't want to say it, Eli whispered, but I will. She drew him close, careful of his pride now as well as her own. You will not have to carry me today. Do you understand? Whatever happens, you are not the one on trial. He held her tighter. Feels like we all are. In the kitchen, Caleb stood by the stove, buttoning his black coat. It was the one he had worn to Alina's burial and almost never since. Ben watched him from the table, pretending to fix the cuff of his sleeve. Ruth wore her best blue ribbon, tied unevenly because she had refused Clara's help twice before quietly allowing it the third time. Amos came in from hitching the wagon and stopped when he saw them all gathered. Well, he said, don't you look like a funeral with boots on? Ruth frowned. That ain't helpful. No, Amos admitted, but it's honest. Caleb took his hat from the peg. His gaze moved over the room, landing for a moment on the quilt frame near the fire. The quilts were not finished, but the pieces were joined enough to show their hearts. Ruth's blue flowers, Ben's brown corners, green shawl strips running through like a promise. Clara saw where he looked. You can still choose not to do this, she said quietly. Caleb turned to her. No, ma'am, I cannot. You and your children will pay for standing beside me. We were paying already, he said, just in quieter coin. Ben looked at his father then, and something passed between them. Not soft, not easy, but true. They rode into Mercy Creek with the wind at their backs. The town seemed to be waiting. Curtains shifted as the wagon passed. Men on the boardwalk stopped mid-sentence. Mrs. Bell stood outside the church steps with two other women and watched Clara as though kindness might be counted against her. Silas Creed's black sleigh waited near the hitching rail, polished clean despite the weather. Clara felt every eye. Her hands folded in her lap. Beneath one glove, she could feel the edge of Joseph's copied letter tucked into her sleeve. The original was hidden where no one would think to look, sewn inside the underside of Eli's poor old blanket, which now rested folded at the bottom of Ruth's toy chest. It was Clara's idea. No one looking for power would search inside something that had once covered a freezing child. Caleb helped her down from the wagon. He did not make a show of it. He simply offered his hand. For one brief moment, Clara hesitated. She knew what that hand would look like to the watching town. She knew Sela's would see. She knew Mrs. Bell's mouth would tighten and Reverend Alcott's shoulders would stiffen. Then she took it. Caleb's hand closed around hers, steady and warm. They climbed the church steps with the children behind them. Inside, the building smelled of pine boards, lamp oil, damp wool, and judgment. The service passed like a dream Clara could not fully hear. Hymns rose around her. Reverend Alcott read from Scripture. Ruth sat close on one side, Eli on the other. Caleb stood at the end of the pew, broad and still. Ben did not sing, but his eyes never left Silas Creed, who sat 2 rows ahead with his hands folded and his head bowed in perfect imitation of a righteous man. After the final hymn, no one moved to leave. Reverend Alcott stepped down from the pulpit, his Bible still in his hand. He was not a cruel man, Clara knew. That almost made it worse. Cruel men were easier to face than fearful good ones. Friends, he began, we have been asked to remain for a matter concerning the welfare and moral peace of this congregation. A murmur moved through the room. Silas rose before he was invited, smooth as oil. I regret the necessity, he said, though nothing in his face suggested regret. But a community must guard more than its fences and ledgers. It must guard its example. Caleb's jaw flexed. Silas continued, his voice calm enough to make every word sound measured. Mrs. Clara Whitcomb suffered a terrible hardship in the storm. No decent soul denies this. Mr. Rusk did a charitable act in bringing her and her child into warmth, but charity has its season. We are now weeks beyond the emergency, and still she remains in his house, a young widow under a widower's roof, children present. No female relation in residence. No proper arrangement made. Mrs. Bell nodded faintly. Silas turned a little, letting his eyes move across the congregation. I ask only this. What lesson are we giving our sons and daughters if we allow appearances to mean nothing? What becomes of order when sentiment excuses impropriety? I move that Mrs. Whitcomb be urged for her own good and the town, to remove herself at once to lodgings approved by the church. For her own good, Ben muttered under his breath. Caleb put a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder. Silas looked toward Clara. And if she refuses, the congregation must consider whether it can continue fellowship with someone who places personal comfort above moral duty. The words were not loud. They did not have to be. Clara felt them settle over her like cold water. For a moment she was back in the cabin. No fire, no wood, Eli too still in her arms, shame whispering that she should have managed, pride whispering that death was better than begging. Then Ruth's small hand slipped into hers. Clara looked down. The child did not look at her. Ruth stared straight ahead, chin raised, but her fingers held on tight. Reverend Alcott shifted uneasily. Mrs. Whitcomb, would you care to speak? Clara stood. The church seemed to tilt beneath her. She was still not fully strong. The room blurred at the edges, but she kept her hand on the pew and made herself face them. My name has been carried through this town all week, she said, so I suppose it is time I carried it myself. A few people looked down. Silas did not. Clara drew a slow breath. The night Mr. Rusk found me, I had burned my last wood. Before that, I burned part of a chair. Before that, I told every person who asked that I was managing. That was my sin, not being in his house, not being warm beside his fire. My sin was pride so stiff it nearly laid my son in a grave. Eli's head bowed. Clara's voice shook, but it did not break. I did not come to Bar Lantern Ranch for comfort. I was carried there because I could not walk. My boy was carried there because he was too cold to wake. If anyone here believes I should have been moved sooner for the sake of appearances, then I ask where those appearances were when my chimney had no smoke for 2 days. The room went still. She looked from face to face. Some eyes softened, some hardened, some could not meet hers at all. I am grateful to Mr. Rusk, she said. I am grateful to his children. I am grateful to Dr. Merton and Judge Bellamy and Mrs. Prout's muslin and every kindness given without a hook in it. But I will not let gratitude be twisted into shame. Silas's mouth tightened. Clara turned toward him. And I will not let a man speak of morals while he hides theft behind a clean collar. A sharp sound moved through the church. Reverend Alcott raised a hand. Mrs. Whitcomb. No, she said, surprising even herself. If my character can be discussed in public, so can his conduct. Caleb stood then, not to stop her, but beside her. The sight of him gave Clara strength she did not want to need and could not deny. She reached into her sleeve and drew out the copied letter. My husband wrote before he died that Silas Creed changed the terms of a loan paper after gaining his trust. Joseph feared he had left Eli and me ruined by a trick. Mr. Creed came to my cabin before the storm and asked for this letter. He did not offer help. He offered silence in exchange for surrender. Silas gave a cold little laugh. Convenient words from a dead man, copied in your own hand. This is a copy, Clara said. The original is safe. Of course it is. Judge Bellamy rose from the back pew. Many had not noticed him come in. I have seen the original, he said. Silas turned slowly. The judge came forward with his cane tapping the floor. The letter alone does not settle the matter, but it is enough to require inquiry, and inquiry has begun. Silas's face remained calm, but a faint color rose at his neck. Judge Bellamy looked toward the congregation. Yesterday, I spoke with a former clerk of Mr. Creed, a young man named Thomas Vale, now working the stage office in Bridger's Mill. He recalls preparing 2 drafts of a loan paper for Joseph Whitcomb, one at fair interest, one at terms severe enough to swallow the claim by spring. Silas said, a clerk's memory is not law. No, the judge replied, but it is a door, and doors often open. A murmur moved again, different this time. Silas lifted his chin. This meeting concerns Mrs. Whitcomb's living arrangement, not old business records. Caleb spoke at last. It concerns a man trying to ruin a woman's name before she can prove he tried to take her land. The words were plain and heavy. Silas looked at him with open dislike now. You should be careful, Rusk. Your sympathy is beginning to look like motive. Caleb stepped into the aisle. My motive was smoke. No one moved. He let the words sit, then continued. I looked toward her place and saw no smoke. That is the whole beginning of this scandal you've all been feeding on, a chimney with no smoke in a blizzard. I rode over because I could not sit warm while wondering whether a woman and child were freezing. They were. His voice roughened, but he did not raise it. I broke her door, found them in bed, blue with cold. That boy had his hand twisted in his mother's sleeve like he was trying to hold her in this world. I brought them home. I put them by my fire. And yes, she stayed. Because my roof did not leak snow, my stove worked, and my children had blankets enough to share. Ruth began to cry silently. Ben stared hard at the floor. Caleb looked around the church. If that is shame, then I will carry it. If that stains my name, then my name needed staining. But do not sit in warm pews and tell me I should have protected the look of decency better than the life of a child. The silence after was deep. Then Eli stood. Clara reached for him, but he shook his head. The boy was small in that room, too small for the weight in his eyes. He clutched Captain the carved horse in one hand, the one Ruth had lent him. I was cold, he said. Two women in the front pew looked away. Eli swallowed. Mama told me morning was coming. I asked if Pa knew where we were. She said he did. Then I went to sleep. When I woke up, Mr. Rusk had me by the fire. His voice trembled. I don't know about church rules. I don't know about papers. But I know if he cared what folks thought, my mama would be buried when the ground thawed. Clara covered her mouth. Mrs. Prout began to weep into her handkerchief. Silas's eyes turned hard as stones. Touching, very touching, but emotion is not innocence. A voice rose from the side pew. No, but neither is polish. Everyone turned. Harlan Pike stood near the wall, hat crushed in both hands. His face was rough, unshaven, and red from drink or cold or fear. He looked as if he had not slept. Silas went very still. Harlan stared at the floor while he spoke. I drove Mr. Creed to Whitcomb's place the day the paper was signed. The room held its breath. Silas's voice came low. Be quiet, Harlan. But Harlan looked up, and something like shame shook through him. No, he said, I've been quiet long enough. Harlan Pike looked like a man standing at the edge of a bridge, with the river calling below. His hat twisted in his hands. His boots were wet from snow. His coat was buttoned wrong, and one sleeve showed a tear near the cuff. He was not the sort of man Mercy Creek trusted. He had hauled freight for Silas Creed too long, slept too often in the livery, and spent too many nights letting whiskey tell him he was not as low as folks believed. But in that church, with every eye on him, Harlan looked less like a scoundrel than a soul too tired to keep carrying the wrong truth. Silas Creed spoke through his teeth. You are drunk. Harlan gave a short, sad laugh. Not today, that's why I can speak plain. The room stayed still. Reverend Alcott stepped forward. Mr. Pike, if you have something truthful to say it carefully. Harlan nodded, but his eyes never left the floor. I drove Mr. Creed to Joseph Whitcomb's claim last fall. Joseph was already poorly then, coughing hard, leaning on the table when he stood. Mr. Creed had 2 papers in his satchel. I saw them both because one fell when he climbed down from the wagon. Silas's face had gone pale in a tight, controlled way. One paper had fair interest, Harlan said. High, but fair enough for hard country. The other had terms no man could meet unless gold started growing in his corn rows. A murmur rolled through the pews. Silas snapped, This is a lie bought by Rusk. Caleb's hands curled, but he did not move. Harlan lifted his head then. Shame reddened his eyes. Ain't nobody bought me, that's the trouble. I sold myself cheap a long while ago, and I'm sick of the taste. For the first time, Clara looked at Harlan not as one of Silas's men, but as a broken witness trying to climb out of his own shadow. Harlan turned toward her. I should have told you, ma'am. When your husband signed, Mr. Creed laid the wrong paper under his hand. Joseph was fevered and trusting. He asked if those were the terms they spoke of. Mr. Creed said yes. Clara gripped the pew back. Eli pressed close to her side. Afterward, Harlan continued, Joseph asked me outside if I knew of steady hauling work, said he had to make winter money fast. He looked scared, not for himself, for you and the boy. Harlan swallowed. I knew then something was rotten, but Mr. Creed paid my wages and I told myself it weren't my business. Judge Bellamy stepped nearer. Would you swear this before the county court? Harlan's throat moved. Silas turned on him fully now, his polished calm gone. Think carefully. Perjury can put a man behind bars. So can fraud, Judge Bellamy said. The church breathed in as one body. Harlan looked at Silas. For a moment old fear pulled at him. It was there in his hunched shoulders and the twitch near his mouth. Then his gaze shifted to Eli. The boy stood beneath the church window, thin from hunger and cold, holding a carved toy horse like it was the last steady thing in the world. Harlan nodded. I'll swear. Silas took one step toward him. Caleb moved faster, placing himself between them without a word. He did not touch Silas. He did not need to. Judge Bellamy lifted his cane slightly. Mr. Creed, I advise you to remain where you are. Silas looked around the church and saw it happening. Faces that had leaned toward him all morning now leaned away. Mrs. Bell's hand had risen to her throat. Mrs. Prout was crying openly. Reverend Alcott looked like a man who had just found a crack in the pulpit beneath his own feet. Silas smiled then, but it was thin and bitter. So this is justice in Mercy Creek, he said. A widow's tears, a child's speech, a drunkard's memory, and a rancher's wounded pride. No, Clara said. Her voice was quiet, but it stopped him. She stepped into the aisle. Caleb glanced at her, ready to steady her if weakness took hold, but she stood on her own. This is what happens when people stop being too afraid to speak. Silas's eyes narrowed. Clara held his gaze. You thought shame would keep me quiet. You thought my being in Mr. Rusk's house would make every truth I told sound dirty. You thought this town would rather judge a widow than admit it nearly let a child freeze. No one spoke. You may still have money, she said. You may still have papers, but you no longer have the dark. For a breath, something raw and hateful showed behind Silas Creed's eyes. Then he turned, took his hat from the pew, and walked toward the door. Judge Bellamy's voice followed him. Do not leave town. Silas paused with his hand on the latch. Judge, he said without turning, you have no order holding me. Not yet. Silas opened the door. Cold sunlight spilled across the church floor. Then I suggest you hurry. He stepped outside, and the door shut behind him. For several moments, Mercy Creek sat in silence. A town can be loud in its cruelty and quiet in its shame. That morning, shame filled the pews so thick that even the children felt it. Reverend Alcott removed his spectacles. His hand trembled as he folded them. Mrs. Whitcomb, he said, voice low, I owe you an apology. Clara did not soften at once. She had been wounded too publicly to accept a quick bandage. Yes, she said, you do. The Reverend bowed his head. Mrs. Bell stood next. Her cheeks were wet, though she looked angry about the tears. I came to Caleb's porch speaking of appearances, she said. I did not come to your cabin before the storm. I have no defense for that. Clara's fingers tightened around the pew. One by one others spoke. Not all. Some stayed silent, which was honest in its own way. But enough voices rose that the room changed. Apologies came rough, awkward, incomplete. Mercy Creek did not heal in a single morning. No town does, but a door had opened. And this time, Clara did not have to break it with her shoulder. When the meeting ended, people moved toward her with bread, offers of wood, promises to repair the roof, and words they should have brought before snow nearly buried her. Clara accepted some, refused others, not from pride alone now, but because she was learning the difference between help and ownership. Mrs. Prout touched Eli's shoulder. I have molasses candy at the store if your mother allows. Eli looked at Clara. She nodded. Ruth whispered, bring me some. Eli almost smiled. Only if you let me keep Captain one more week. Ruth considered this bargain with grave importance. 3 days. 5. 4. Done. Ben rolled his eyes, but his mouth twitched. Near the back of the church, Harlan Pike stood alone. as if confession had left him unsure where a man like him should put his hands. Clara walked to him. He stiffened. "I do not know yet if I can thank you," she said. "I don't expect it. You waited too long." "Yes, ma'am. My husband died afraid because men kept silent." Harlan closed his eyes briefly. "I know." Clara looked at his worn face, the shame sitting there plain. "But you spoke today." He nodded once. "That may save my son's home." His voice broke. "I hope it does." She left him with that, not forgiveness, not yet, but not nothing either. Outside, the winter sun struck the snow so bright that Clara had to shade her eyes. The town seemed too sharp, too clear, like the world after a fever. Caleb brought the wagon around. Ruth climbed in first, then Eli, then Ben. Clara stood on the church steps for a moment, looking back at Mercy Creek. Caleb came beside her. "You stood well," he said. "I was shaking." Standing and shaking still counts. She glanced at him. A small smile touched her mouth, then faded. "This is not over." "No. He may run. Judge Bellamy will send riders. He may destroy the papers. Then Harlan's word and Joseph's letter will carry what they can." Clara looked toward Silas's freight office down the street. The windows were dark, though it was near noon. A black sleigh track cut through the snow toward the south road. Her heart tightened. "Caleb." He followed her gaze. The sleigh was gone. Judge Bellamy saw it too. He came down the steps faster than his age seemed to allow. "Creed's office," he called to the sheriff, who had been standing near the hitching post with his hat low. "Now." The sheriff and two men moved at once. But the door of the freight office stood locked, and when they forced it open, Silas Creed was not inside. His desk drawers had been emptied. The stove was still warm. In the ash pan lay blackened scraps of paper, curled and fragile as dead leaves. Judge Bellamy stood over them with a grim face. "He burned something," the sheriff said. "Not everything," Caleb answered. He was looking at the floor. Near the desk, half tucked beneath the edge of a rug, lay a small brass key. Clara picked it up. There was a number stamped on its handle. 7. Judge Bellamy looked at it sharply. "That is not for this office." Mrs. Pruitt, who had followed behind with half the town despite being told not to, leaned in from the doorway. "That looks like a depot lockbox key," she said. "Stage office keeps them for mail parcels and private papers." "Mercy Creek Depot?" Caleb asked. Mrs. Pruitt shook her head. "No, we only have 4 boxes." Judge Bellamy turned the key over. "Bridger's Mill has 12. Thomas Vale, the former clerk, worked in Bridger's Mill. Silas's southbound sleigh tracks led the same way." Caleb looked at Clara. The meaning passed between them without words. If Silas reached Bridger's Mill first, he could frighten Thomas Vale, empty the lockbox, and bury the last proof under fresh snow. Judge Bellamy faced the sheriff. "Can you ride?" The sheriff looked toward the road. "Not fast enough in this snow with my mare." "I can," Ben said. Caleb turned. "No." Ben had climbed down from the wagon, his face set. "Daisy can take the lower trail through Cottonwood Draw. I know it better than anyone." "No. Pa, he'll get there first." "I said no." Ben stepped closer, anger and hurt rising together. "You rode through a blizzard for Miss Clara because it was right. Now you're telling me not to ride in daylight on a trail I know." "That was different." "Because you're grown. Because I'm your father." Ben's voice cracked. "Then act like you know I'm not a little boy hiding on the stairs anymore." The words struck Caleb hard. People watched. Caleb hated that. But Ben did not look away, and in his son's face he saw not rebellion, but the ache of a boy who had waited years to be trusted with more than chores and silence. Clara came down the steps slowly. "Ben." He looked at her, breathing hard. "If you go, you do not go to prove you are brave," she said. "Brave boys can be foolish and still end up dead." Ben swallowed. "You go only if you can be careful enough to come back." "I can." Caleb looked at Clara. startled by both her words and the fact that they had steadied his son where his own had only sharpened him. Judge Bellamy spoke. "We need a rider to carry a message ahead to Thomas Vale, not to confront Creed, not to chase him. Just warn Vale to secure whatever he has and wait for the law." Caleb looked at the South Road, then at Ben's. Every father reaches a day when protecting a child begins to look too much like holding him back from the man he must become. Caleb had known the day would come. He had not expected it to come in snow, with half the town watching and Sela's Creed running ahead of justice. "If I let you ride," Caleb said, "you take the draw, avoid the ridge, and stop at Miller's Crossing if the wind turns." Ben nodded quickly. "You do not approach Creed." "No, sir." "You do not play hero." "No, sir." "You come back." Ben's eyes softened. "Yes, sir." Caleb stepped close and gripped the back of his son's neck, the way his own father had done when words were too much. "Then ride." Ben ran for the livery. Ruth began to cry. Eli stood beside her, pale and silent. Clara touched Ruth's shoulder, but her eyes stayed on Caleb. She saw the fear he was holding still inside his chest. If this moment made you think of someone who once stood up for you, let me know in the comments. Sometimes one brave voice can change the whole room. Within minutes, Ben was mounted on Daisy, his coat buttoned high, Judge Bellamy's sealed note tucked inside his shirt. Caleb walked beside the horse to the edge of town. "Remember," Caleb said. "I know." "Say it." Ben took a breath. "Lower trail, no ridge, stop if the wind turns, warn Thomas Vale, do not go near Creed, come back." Caleb nodded. Ben looked suddenly younger. "Pa." "Yes." "Ma would have let me go." Caleb felt the question in every old wound. "No," he said, "she would have told me I was a fool for letting you." Ben's face fell a little. Then Caleb added, "And after you rode off, she would have stood at the window praying proud." Ben's eyes shone. Caleb slapped Daisy's flank lightly. "Go." The horse leapt forward, hooves striking snow, and Ben rode south toward Cottonwood Draw with the whole town watching. Clara came to Caleb's side. Together they stood in the road until the boy and horse disappeared among the white cottonwoods. Only then did Caleb let his hand tremble. Ben vanished into Cottonwood Draw, and Mercy Creek seemed to hold its breath behind him. For a long moment, no wagon moved, no door opened, no one spoke loud enough to be heard. The only sound was Daisy's fading hoofbeats, quick and careful, until the trees swallowed them and left nothing but white road and winter sun. Caleb stood in the street with his hands at his sides. Clara had seen men look afraid before. Joseph had looked afraid near the end when fever loosened the truth from him. Harlan Pike had looked afraid in the church with shame dragging at his boots, but Caleb's fear was different. It did not move much. It stood straight and quiet, wearing a father's coat. Ruth ran to him and wrapped both arms around his waist. "He'll come back," she said, though her voice shook. Caleb put one hand on her head. "Yes." It was not a promise he could make. He made it anyway because children need something firm to lean against when the world turns thin. Judge Bellamy sent the sheriff and 2 riders by the main road, slower but safer, in hopes of reaching Bridger's Mill before dark. Harlan Pike offered to go, but the judge told him to stay where the court could find him. That seemed to trouble Harlan more than riding into danger would have. Clara watched the South Road until her eyes hurt. Eli stood beside her, Captain the carved horse tucked under his arm. "Ben knows the trail?" he asked. "His father says he does." "That ain't what I asked." Clara looked down at him. The boy had changed in the last days, not grown exactly, but sharpened by truth. Childhood still lived in his face, yet there was a new steadiness behind his eyes. "Yes," she said, "he knows it." Eli nodded, as if storing that answer somewhere. They did not return to the bar lantern right away. Caleb would not leave town until there was word. Clara knew better than to argue. The sheriff had asked everyone to clear away from Sela's Creed's freight office, but half the town lingered near the boardwalk in small, uneasy groups, speaking softly, looking south. Mrs. Bell approached Clara with a bundle in her arms. "I brought this from my sleigh," she said. "For Ruth, she looks cold." It was a wool lap blanket, red and black, finer than anything Clara owned. Clara took it, then looked at the woman's tight face. "Thank you." Mrs. Bell nodded. "I should have brought one to your cabin in December." The words came out stiff, but they came. Clara studied her. "Yes, you should have." Clara did not offer comfort, not because she wanted Mrs. Bell to suffer, but because some guilt needed to stand long enough to teach. At last she said, "Next time look for smoke." Mrs. Bell nodded, tears bright in her eyes. "I will." By afternoon, clouds gathered low over the southern hills. The clean morning light went dull. Wind began pushing loose snow across the road in thin lines, and every adult in Mercy Creek started glancing at the sky. Caleb saw it too. His face hardened. "You told him to stop if it did." "I did." "Then trust him." Caleb gave a humorless breath. "That is a cruel thing to ask of a father." "I know." He looked at her then. She did know. She had trusted a dead man's letter, a borrowed roof, a child's forgiveness, and the thin chance that truth might matter in a town hungry for scandal. Caleb's shoulders lowered a little. "I held him too tight after a leaner died," he said. Clara waited. "I thought if I kept him close enough, I could make up for the mother he lost, but mostly I taught him grief was a locked door." "He opened one today." "Yes," Caleb said, "and I let him ride through it." The wind rose. Ruth sat in the wagon with Mrs. Bell's blanket around her shoulders, her face pale with worry. Eli sat beside her, letting her hold Captain now without making a bargain over it. That small kindness did not escape Clara. Then near dusk, a rider came from the south. Not Bend. The whole street stiffened. The horse was lathered, and the man wore the badge of the Bridger's Mill deputy. He pulled up before Judge Bellamy and swung down hard. "Creed reached town before your boy," the deputy said. Caleb stepped forward. "Where is Ben?" The deputy looked at him. "Alive when I left him." Clara felt the words strike Caleb like a blow. "When you left him," Caleb demanded. "Listen first. Your boy beat the storm through the draw, but Creed had taken the Ridge Road and got there near the same time. Creed went straight to the stage office. Thomas Vale had already locked the back room because your boy shouted warning from the street before Creed made the door." Judge Bellamy gripped his cane. "Did Vale secure the papers?" "He did. Lockbox 7. Original drafts. Ledger copies. A note in Creed's own hand ordering Vale to destroy the fair contract after Whitcomb signed." A sound moved through the gathered people. Not gossip this time, shock. Clara covered her mouth. Joseph had been telling the truth, all of it. Caleb's voice was tight. "And Ben?" The deputy looked grim. "Creed tried to leave. Your boy followed him as far as the bridge." Caleb's face drained. "He was told not to go near Creed," Clara whispered. The deputy nodded. "I reckon boys hear rules different when they think justice is running off." "What happened?" Caleb asked. "Creed's sleigh struck the bridge rail in the wind. Wheels split. Horse went wild. Creed was thrown clear, not bad hurt. Your boy could have turned back." The deputy paused. "Instead, he helped cut the horse loose before it broke its leg in the traces." Ruth began crying again. "Ben did?" Eli asked. "Yes," the deputy said. "Then Creed tried to run on foot with a satchel. Your boy took Daisy across his path, did not draw a weapon, did not strike him. Just sat that mare in the road and said, 'My pa told me not to play hero, so I'm only asking you to wait for the law.'" Despite the fear, Amos barked a laugh from somewhere behind them. The deputy's mouth twitched. "The sheriff arrived 2 minutes after. Creed is held in Bridger's Mill. Judge, they need you by morning if the weather allows." Caleb closed his eyes, but only for a second. "Where is my son now?" "At Miller's Crossing. Wind turned hard after the arrest. He did exactly what you told him then, stopped at the mill house with my brother's family. Safe, fed, and proud enough to be irritating." Caleb turned away. His shoulders shook once. Clara reached toward him, then stopped. This grief was not hers to handle unless invited. But Caleb turned back and took her hand. "Right there in the street. Not hidden, not careless, simply needing something steady." Clara let him hold it. "Mercy Creek saw." No one spoke. The next morning, Caleb rode with Judge Bellamy to Bridger's Mill. This time he did not ride alone. The sheriff went. Dr. Merton went. Harlan Pike went under guard, but willingly. Clara wanted to go, but her strength had limits, and Eli begged her not to leave before Ben came back. So she stayed at the bar lantern with the children, waiting beside the unfinished quilts. Waiting had its own kind of cold. Ruth paced. Eli carved at a scrap of wood with a dull knife Amos had given him. Clara stitched because still hands would have driven her mad. Each pull of thread became a prayer. Not only for Ben, but for Caleb, for Joseph's name, for the truth traveling dangerous roads. Near sundown, the wagon returned. Ben sat beside Caleb, wrapped in a borrowed coat, cheeks red from wind, eyes bright with the terrible glory of having done something grown and survived it. Ruth flew off the porch first. Ben barely had time to climb down before she hit him with both arms. "You broke your promise," she cried. "No, I didn't. You went near him." "I went near the road he was on." "That is the same thing." "It is not." She hugged him harder. Eli stood back, then held out Captain. "You can keep him tonight." Ben stared at the wooden horse. "Ain't that Ruth S.?" "Mostly," Eli said, "but he's brave, so I thought he should stay by you." Ben took it with great seriousness. "Much obliged." Clara watched Caleb step down from the wagon. He looked tired enough to fall, but there was something lighter in him. "The papers?" she asked. He nodded, "Safe with Judge Bellamy." "And Sela's?" "Held until formal charges are brought. Fraud, coercion, destruction of records. The judge thinks more will follow once his ledgers are examined." Clara breathed in, but the relief did not come all at once. It came slowly, painfully, like warmth returning to frozen fingers. "My land." Caleb removed his hat. "Yours, the false debt will be challenged. Judge says Creed's claim won't stand." For a moment, Clara did not move. Then she sat down on the porch step, as if her knees had forgotten their work. Eli came to her side. "Mama." She pulled him close, and this time he came easily. "We can go home?" he asked. The question pierced the evening. Home? The little claim with the broken stove, the roof that had let in snow, Joseph's grave on the hill, the place where they had nearly died, the place that was theirs. Caleb heard it too. Clara saw the shadow pass across his face before he lowered his eyes. "Yes," Clara whispered to Eli, "when spring comes we can go home." Ruth went very still. Ben looked at his father. No one said what the words had done to the porch. That night the house was warm, but a new kind of silence filled it. Not the old dead silence from before Clara came. This one was alive and aching. After supper, the children fell asleep near the fire, exhausted from fear and relief. Ruth's head rested against Eli's shoulder. Ben slept in the chair with Captain in his lap like he had forgotten to pretend he was too old for such things. Clara sat at the quilting frame. Caleb stood near the window, looking out toward the dark hills. "You have your answer now," he said softly. She knew what he meant. The land was saved. The danger had shifted. Spring would come. "I suppose I do," she said. He nodded as if that was all a man could ask. Clara's needle paused above Eleanor's blue flowers. The whole winter seemed to gather in that small space between them. The rescue, the letter, the church, the children, the quilts, the hand he had taken in the street. Caleb did not turn around. "I told myself I was keeping you here because it was right," he said. "It was, but somewhere along the way, right stopped being the whole truth." Clara's heart beat hard. Before she could answer, a floorboard creaked. Ben stood in the doorway, awake, pale, and listening. Behind him, Ruth stood too. And beside the stove, Eli opened his eyes. The children had heard everything. The room held still around Caleb's unfinished words. Ben stood in the doorway with Ruth beside him, both children wrapped in the kind of silence that comes when young hearts hear more than grown folks meant to give. Eli sat up near the stove, his hair rumpled, his eyes moving from his mother to Caleb and back again. Clara lowered her needle. Caleb turned from the window slowly. The lamplight showed the worry in his face and something else too, not guilt, not shame, a man past hiding. Ben spoke first. "You want her to stay." It was not a question. Caleb drew a breath. Yes. Ruth's eyes filled at once, but she did not cry. And Eli. Caleb looked at the boy by the stove. Him too, if that is what they want. Eli looked down at Captain the carved horse, now resting beside Ben's chair. He did not speak. His face was troubled, not unhappy, but burdened by choices a child should never have to weigh. Clara rose from the quilting frame. Children should be in bed. Ben's mouth tightened. That is what grown folks say when they want to talk about children without them. The words stung because they were true. Clara looked at him, then at Ruth, then at Eli. The fire shifted behind her with a soft crackle. Outside, the last of the day's wind brushed snow against the porch. "You are right," she said. Ben seemed surprised enough to lose some of his anger. Clara folded her hands together. "Then hear the truth. Your father saved my life and Eli's. This house gave us warmth when we had none. You children gave Eli friendship when he had only fear, and I have come to care for all of you more than I knew was possible after losing so much." Ruth stepped closer. "Then why go?" Clara's throat tightened. "Because I have land that Joseph left. Because Eli has a father buried on that hill. Because if I stay only because I was rescued, some part of me will always wonder if I mistook gratitude for love." Caleb looked down. Ruth whispered, "Do you love us?" The question entered the room as gently as a hand, and still it shook Clara to the bone. She crossed to Ruth and knelt before her. "Yes." Ruth's tears spilled then. Clara took her small hands. "I love your stubborn heart. I love the way you remember blue flowers and pretend not to be afraid. I love how you share what matters, even when you make a bargain first." Ruth gave a broken little laugh. Clara looked at Ben. "And I love your brother's courage, even when it runs faster than good sense." Ben glanced away, but his eyes shone. Then Clara turned to Eli. "And I love my son enough to choose carefully, not from fear, and not because winter trapped us under one roof." Eli stood slowly. "Do you love Mr. Rusk?" No one breathed. Clara looked at Caleb. The answer had been growing for weeks, hidden in small things, in coffee set near her hand, in the way he listened when she spoke of Joseph without jealousy, in the sight of him carrying Alina's blue dress down from the loft, in his hand trembling in the street after Ben rode away, in his rough voice saying right was no longer the whole truth. "Yes," Clara said softly, "I believe I do." Caleb shut his eyes for 1 second, as if the words hurt and healed him at the same time. Ruth ran to Clara and threw her arms around her neck. Eli came next, slower, but he came. Ben stood stiff for a moment, fighting himself, then moved close enough for Clara to reach his hand. Caleb stayed where he was. This moment belonged first to the children. Spring did not come quickly to Mercy Creek. Winter loosened its grip by inches. Snow melted from the south-facing slopes first. The creek began to speak under its ice. Wagons sank in mud where sleigh runners had passed for months. Smoke rose from chimneys with a new meaning in the valley, because after Clara's story, people looked. They looked toward the lonely claims. They looked toward widow cabins. They looked toward old men's shacks and distant barns. A chimney with no smoke was no longer just a thing to notice. It was a call. Silas Creed's downfall came without gunfire, without a hanging rope, without the wild justice men sometimes sing about in saloons. It came in ledgers, witness statements, signed papers, and one frightened clerk who finally told Judge Bellamy where the rest of the records had been hidden. The false debt against Clara's land was struck down. Other debts were questioned. Men who had lost horses, tools, and acres to Silas's fine print came forward one by one. Harlan Pike testified in court with shaking hands and a clear voice. He did not become a hero, and he did not ask to be called one. But he stopped drinking for a while, took honest hauling work, and tipped his hat to Clara whenever they passed. Silas Creed was taken east to face a longer court than Mercy Creek could give him. He left town in a wagon, not a polished sleigh. No one threw stones. No one cheered. They only watched, and that was punishment enough for a man who had lived on being admired. Clara went back to her claim when the road dried. Caleb helped fix the roof, but he did not move her things for her unless she asked. Ben repaired the sagging gate. Eli planted a row of beans near the cabin wall because Joseph had once said the soil might still surprise them. Ruth placed a little blue cloth flower, one Clara had made from a leftover scrap of Alina's dress, on Joseph Whitcomb's grave. Clara stood there a long while when she saw it. Then she took Ruth's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. Ruth leaned against her. He was Eli's pa, he ought to have something pretty. That evening, Clara lit her own stove in her own cabin. The smoke rose straight and gray into the soft spring air. Across the valley, Caleb stood at the bar lantern fence and watched it. For the first time, smoke from Clara's chimney did not make him worry. It made him wait. He waited because he had promised himself he would not ask her while winter still held them together. He waited because Clara deserved to stand on her own floor, under her own mended roof, with her son safe and her land clear. He waited because love offered too soon can look too much like another debt. 3 weeks later, Clara came to the bar lantern with Eli beside her and a bundle in her arms. The children were outside when she arrived. Ruth saw her first and ran so fast her bonnet fell back on its strings. Ben followed at a slower pace, trying hard to look like he had not been watching the road every afternoon. Caleb came out to the porch. Clara looked different in the spring light. Still thin, still marked by the winter behind her, but standing with a strength that belonged fully to her now. "I brought something," she said. Inside, she laid the bundle across the table and unfolded it. Ruth's quilt was finished. The blue flowers from Alina's dress bloomed across the center. The green shawl ran through the pattern like a river. A bit of flour sack sat near one corner for biscuits. A small brown square held the memory of the kitchen chair where Alina had once brushed Ruth's hair. Ruth touched it with both hands and began to cry. Then Clara unfolded Ben's. His was deeper, steadier, made with brown work cloth, green wool, and strong pieces from Caleb's old shirts. In one corner, Clara had stitched a small shape of a horse, plain and careful, almost hidden unless a person knew to look. Ben stared at it. "I told you I did not need one," he said. Clara smiled. "I know." He swallowed hard, then pressed the quilt to his chest and turned away before anyone could see his face clearly. Caleb watched his children hold what Clara had made from Alina's memory, and the last locked room in him opened. Later, when the children had carried the quilts upstairs, Caleb and Clara stood on the porch. The air smelled of damp earth, new grass, and distant rain. Eli and Ruth were arguing near the barn over who owned Captain now, while Ben pretended not to listen from the fence. Caleb removed his hat. "I told myself I would wait until you had your land clear," he said. Clara looked at him, her eyes calm but bright. "I told myself I would wait until you could choose without owing me anything, until you had your own fire again, until Mercy Creek had no say in it that mattered. And now I am asking." He took a breath, and for once the steady rancher looked almost shy. "Clara Whitcomb, I have room by my fire, but I know now you do not need it to survive. You have your own. You have your land, your boy, your name, and your work. So I am not asking you to come because winter drove you here. I am asking because this house was cold before you crossed its door, and after you left I learned the warmth was not only the stove." Clara's eyes filled. Caleb's voice grew rough. "Marry me, not to quiet the town, not to answer gossip, not to pay a debt. Marry me because I love you, because my children love you, because Eli has already started leaving his carved horses in my barn like he means to stay, and because I cannot look at that chair by the fire without seeing you stitching there." Clara looked toward the hills where her own chimney smoked in the distance. Then she looked back at the man who had ridden toward no smoke when everyone else looked away. "I was afraid," she said. "Afraid to need help, afraid to love again, afraid that if I stepped into warmth it might be taken from me." Caleb waited. "But you never asked me to be less than Joseph's widow," she continued. "You never asked me to forget him. You gave my son a place to heal, and you trusted me with your wife's memory. That is not a small thing, Caleb Rusk." "No," he said softly, "it is not." She took his hand. "Yes," she whispered, "I will marry you." From the yard, Ruth screamed with joy so loud the horses startled. Ben shouted, "Ruth, hush." But he was smiling. Eli ran up the porch steps and hugged Caleb around the middle with no warning at all. Caleb froze for half a second, then rested his hand on the boy's back. That was how the new family began, not with forgetting, but with making room. They married in June beneath cottonwoods near the creek. Mercy Creek came, quieter and kinder than it had been that winter. Mrs. Bell brought bread. Mrs. Prout brought muslin ribbons. Dr. Merton complained about the heat and cried anyway. Judge Bellamy stood beside the couple with his cane planted in the grass, looking pleased with the law and love both. Harlan Pike stayed at the edge of the gathering, hat in hand. Clara saw him and gave a small nod. It was not full forgiveness yet, but it was a road toward it. On the wedding night, Clara placed one quilt at the foot of her new bed. Not Ruth's, not Ben's. A plain quilt made from scraps of her old cabin life, Joseph's worn shirt cuff, Eli's torn blanket, and one square of blue from Alina's dress given by Ruth herself. Caleb touched that blue square. "She would have liked you," he said. Clara looked at him gently. "I hope so." "She would have said I was too slow asking." Clara laughed, and the sound filled the room like a lamp being lit. Years passed. Clara's quilts became known far beyond Mercy Creek. Women came from 3 counties to learn her patterns. She taught Ruth fine stitching and taught Eli how to mend a tear without shame. Ben grew tall, steady, and kinder than he feared he could be. Every winter, Ruth and Ben slept under their mother's colors, not as children trapped in grief, but as children warmed by love that had changed shape and stayed. Eli grew up knowing he had 2 fathers in his story. One buried on a hill who had loved him enough to leave the truth. One who rode through snow because a chimney had no smoke. And Clara never forgot the cold. Not in a way that made her bitter, in a way that made her watchful. Whenever winter came hard to Mercy Creek, she stood at the window of the bar lantern and looked toward the far claims. Caleb often stood beside her. Sometimes one of them would see a chimney missing smoke, and before fear could settle fully, a horse would be saddled, a wagon loaded, a neighbor called. No one in those hills froze alone again if Clara Rusk could help it. The final truth was simple. A town had nearly let pride and appearances bury a widow and child. A greedy man had tried to use shame as a lock. But one rider, one letter, one boy's courage, one little girl's memory, and one woman's hands turned cold scraps into something strong enough to cover them all. If this story warmed your heart, don't forget to like, comment where you're watching from, and subscribe for more emotional Wild West stories where love, pain, and justice meet on the frontier. And long after Mercy Creek forgot the worst of that winter, folks still told the story of Clara Whitcomb and Caleb Rusk. They told of the widow who thought no one would come. They told of the widower who saw no smoke and rode anyway. And they told of the fire he shared, not because he cared what people would say, but because a good name means nothing if it is kept warm while someone else is left in the cold.